Book 3, Part 11. Every now and then we heard people talking outside, but no one came and knocked on the door. The time slipped by and I didn't care. I inhaled slowly and lifted my chin, gently nuzzling his neck. He moaned softly and I smiled. There were some perks to being female. When he tilted his neck, I lifted up some, ignoring the pain in my arm. I let my lips gently brush his skin and felt his heartbeat quicken. I kissed along his jaw until he turned, and then I kissed his lips. My own heart was racing and I was feeling braver than normal. I moved a bit and then turned. Another wave of bravery, and I flung one leg over his lap and turned again. Now I was straddling him, and his eyes were wide with shock. I smiled, leaned forward, and kissed him again. He didn't protest, and his arms wrapped around my waist. My arms were on the back of the couch, and I fought to ignore the shooting pain from my broken one, determined not to spoil this burst of bravery on my part. When I pulled back, just a little, Phil was panting hard, and I smiled, enjoying feeling a bit more in control. I looked into his brown eyes, and he blinked up at me. Then I sat back, keeping my arms on each side of him. He looked from one of my eyes to the other, and I let him, my heart racing as he stared at me. "You better knock first," I heard someone say from outside, and I stiffened. It was Rock, and by the sound of his voice, it was a warning. I jumped off Phil's lap and was standing when the door flew open. It slammed into the coat-fill rack behind it, as Track stormed in, Rock on his heels. Again, I felt a wave of heat in my face, and I put a good hand to my cheek. What was happening to me? Track glared at me, then his eyes turned hard on Phil. My wolf smiled and stood up slowly, making my eyes wide. "Can we help you?" Phil asked calmly, his eyes sparkling playfully. "You," Track huffed, pointing a finger at me, and then glaring at Phil. "You two aren't—" Wow, he was spitting mad, and his red face emphasized it. "When did Track turn into such a prude?" Rock chuckled, stepping around him and smiling at me. He stood next to me, blocking Track's intense glare. "He's turned into a prude." Track huffed, and Phil shook his head. "No, he's right." "Call it what you want. Maybe I should go ask your mom what she thinks about it." Yikes, that was uncalled for. I frowned, and so very unlike my best friend. He was usually all for breaking the rules and sneaking around behind the adults' backs. But Phil shook his head. "You do, and we'll have to be having a wedding here tonight." I gasped and covered my mouth, but Phil only stepped up to Track, eyeing him, but not glaring. "You, my friend, are lucky we're packmates." I looked up at Rock, who smiled and winked at me. Track growled, but seemed to relax a bit. Finally, he even grinned, and Phil shook his head. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." My best friend shrugged. "You're really pushing that." "So, Track," Rock said, walking over to the guys. I moaned and took a step back. Why did I have a feeling this was going to end in more broken furniture? "What color dress are you going to wear at their wedding?" I moaned and moved even further back. Track's eyes lowered and Rock nodded. "I hear the bride's best friend usually wears one that matches—" That was as far as he got when Track lunged. He actually caught air and slammed into Rock, taking him down fast. I jumped out of the way as they landed at my feet and quickly moved to the other side of the room. "I'll put you in a pink taffy dress," Track grunted as they rolled. "It's taffeta, dork," Rock laughed, barely avoiding a fist. Phil and I looked at each other, and even Track paused for a moment. Rock shrugged. What? You learn a thing or two hanging out at the mall. Track threw his fist, and Phil reached over and pulled me towards him. Let's go outside, he whispered. I smiled, and we both tiptoed to and out the door. I flinched when I heard a crash behind us, and Phil groaned. They're gonna get us kicked out of here, he stated. I shivered, and he frowned, then went back inside. Another thump, and this time Phil cursed. Track's voice got louder, and then I heard wood splinter. Ugh, I moaned, and turned to see Ryan heading my way. Phil opened the door, 2 coats in his hand. The smile fell when he saw our alpha storm up the walkway. I took the coat he handed me and quickly slipped it on, not noticing it had somehow been cleaned. Ryan ignored us both and disappeared inside the cabin. Phil shrugged, grabbed my hand, and we both ran down the walk, in case our alpha changed his mind. Chapter 13. I felt bad for laughing, but couldn't help it. Phil had my good hand as we jogged down the path away from the cabin. We ran part way around the circle before we stopped, and then looked at each other, still smiling. They are in so much trouble, I giggled. Phil nodded, smiling back, and then we both turned to see Cal trot over, with 2 little ones in tow. Al I recognized, but I smiled, seeing the little girl running next to him. This is Jessie, Al stated when they reached us. I knelt down and said hello. The little blonde girl blushed, hiding part of her face in the zipper of her light pink coat. She's kinda shy, Al stated, and I nodded. I am too. 2 blue eyes looked up at me, and I grinned back. Finally, her whole face appeared, and she blinked slowly. She wanted to come meet you earlier, Al said, and I noticed a bit of pride in his voice. But the grown-ups said she had to wait. They always tell us we have to wait. I chuckled then. I know that feeling. He smiled and nudged her arm a little, but I noticed he was staying close to her. I looked at the 2 of them and smiled again. Al was protective of her. I like your jacket, I tried, not sure what else to say. She looked down at herself, and I shrugged. They put me in this awful thing so they could spot me. A small giggle, and she nodded. Us female werewolves understood the glass house we were kept in. It was out of love, but it could definitely be annoying. I wanted dark blue, she whispered. It's my favorite color. Really? I gasped, being a bit more theatrical than needed. It's my favorite color, too. It wasn't actually, but her eyes widened and Al looked up at Phil. I knew it was Jessie's favorite color, he huffed, and I heard a bit of challenge in his young voice. Phil knelt next to me and he sighed. Well, you have bested me yet again. I thought Reina liked pink. My eyes widened and he winked at me. He knew I hated pink. Everyone knew that. He was playing. Al's chin lifted. You should know what things she likes. Cal cleared his throat and Al growled a little at his brother. I coughed to cover my laugh. He was trying to musk in front of us to show off for his young girl. She blushed and I smiled. Well, that color looks very pretty on you. She smiled and then looked at my coat and bit her lower lip. Yeah, this thing was hideous. Okay, you 2, Cal smiled. You said hello, now off you go. Al crossed his arms over his chest and his older brother leaned down and whispered something into his ear. Whatever it was made his eyes go wide, and he turned. Come on, Jessie. She took his hand, smiled at me, and they turned and walked off. I stood and watched them, amazed. Cal pointed behind us. Take that path there and follow it south. When you hit the small stream, turn east. There is a large rock next to an old tree. You can't miss it. What's there? I asked. A quiet place, he smiled. Thanks, Phil replied, and Cal nodded, turning and walking back towards the main part of the camp. I looked over my shoulder. I don't think Ryan would be happy with us wandering off. Phil took my hand. I'm a click alpha, he stated as we started to walk. He might worry if you were with the others, but he knows I have a clear head on my shoulders. I smiled and followed him towards the worn path. The trees quickly consumed what little light was left, and we made our way through the forest slowly, laughing when we almost tripped. Polson Forest I know inside and out, he stated, looking up to check the moon, to see which way we were headed. It's a bit humbling to stagger through strange territory. I nodded in agreement, remembering my own horrific attempt. We found the stream, and then the rock. Phil seemed to know what he was looking for, and moved over to a large tree. Okay, you first, just take it slow, he stated, and I frowned, stepping closer to him. Then I saw it. Grooves cut into the tree at regular intervals. I looked up, only seeing darkness. What's up there? Only one way to find out, he chuckled, then looked at my hand. Maybe we should find somewhere else. I huffed, walked over, and put my good hand in one of the grooves just above my head. I was not a soft paw, broken arm or not. The first few steps were easy enough. After that, my broken arm protested as I climbed. It was throbbing by the time I reached a hole cut into what looked like a platform. I took a few more steps up, and my head popped through the opening. Wow, I exclaimed as I pulled myself up and moved out of the way so Phil could climb in. It wasn't just a platform. There were walls, too, and a roof. A treehouse, he replied as he moved up next to me. Impressive. We both stood and I looked around. The ceiling was only an inch above his head, and it was only about 5 feet wide, but it was sturdy. I put my hand on one of the walls and then knocked. Solid. Check this out, Phil stated, and I carefully stepped around the hole in the floor. He pushed on the wall, and a square piece opened outward on a hinge. Windows, he chuckled. That was about all there was to this secret place, but we both admitted it was amazing. Finally, we sat down, and Phil noticed a board propped in the corner. It had a rope handle on it. He lifted it and then laid it over the hole in the floor. I sat back down, leaning back against one wall. He moved over next to me, and we had another long bit of silence that was nice. You know, with some curtains and a few pieces of furniture, this could make a nice summer home, I chuckled. Phil put his arm out, and I moved over, snuggling up against him. Yeah, just watch that first step. We both laughed, and I laid my head on his shoulder, forgetting the throbbing in my arm. More time passed, and we both enjoyed the privacy and the quiet, listening to the soft wind outside and the occasional scurrying of whatever small animals claimed part of this tree as their home as well. Tenants, Phil whispered as one of them ran right over the roof. We could charge 'em rent. I nodded, as long as we're willing to accept nuts and acorns as payment. It would be fine in the summer, he added, but might be too cold in the winter. I wrapped my good arm around his waist. Don't worry, I'll keep you warm. He chuckled and nuzzled the top of my head. I'm sold then. When do we move in? We actually both nodded off for a bit, holding each other in the cozy little treehouse. It felt good to be completely alone with him, and I frowned when he moved just a bit. Not yet, I whispered. We don't have to leave, he whispered back, but my arm is falling asleep. He chuckled when I sat up and then pulled his arm out from behind me. It had been pressed between me and the wall, and he shook it to get the feeling back in it. Sorry, I smiled, and he shook his head. Don't be. This is nice. Something moved in the bushes below, and we both exchanged looks. They're around here somewhere. Phil's lip curled back at the sound of Track's voice, and my lips tightened. Okay, this was just going too far. Phil put a finger to his lips, and I nodded, smiling. We both froze and listened to Track and Jackson below. I smell them right here, Track huffed, and I covered my mouth to keep from laughing. They didn't know about the treehouse, and were trying to figure out how our scents ended right here, but we were nowhere to be seen. Phil's brows wiggled at me, and I held my breath as Jackson cursed. They're playing with us. Track gave a low growl. That's okay. They don't call me Track for nothing. Then everything went quiet. We both glanced at the rope handle, knowing it wouldn't take Track long to figure it out. Phil moved fast then, throwing himself on the cover, just as someone tried to push up. His body bounced a bit, and I laughed and quickly laid over Phil's back sideways, adding more weight. Another string of cursing from underneath, and then I cried out as we were both thrown back. I grunted as I slammed into the wall, the back of my head making contact with the hard wood. Phil rushed over to me, ignoring the two forms that crawled in through the now open hole. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice worried. I giggled and nodded. I was fine. For once, it was just a bump. My wolf now turned on the other two. "Care to explain yourselves?" he growled. Track moved over next to me, but Jackson was inspecting the small wooden cave. "This is pretty cool," he stated, running a hand over the opposite wall. "There better be a really, really good reason you're here," Phil snapped, and I turned and glared at Track. He only smiled back. "There is." When he didn't reply, Phil leaned over me, putting himself nearly nose to nose with my best friend. Track shrugged. The healers said she needs to come back and have her arm tended to. He shrugged again and wiggled his brows at our click alpha. Phil's growl rumbled through us all, and I saw Track try not to flinch. Squaring off among pack mates is one thing, but Phil was our alpha. I reached out and put my hand on Track's arm, feeling the need to stop him from doing something incredibly stupid. I knew he was being protective of me, and I loved him for it, so I thought it best to stop this fast. It worked, and Phil sat back a bit. "Tell them she'll be there in a bit," he stated, moving the cover and looking at the opening. "No can do," Jackson chirped. "We were told to bring her back." "Bye," Phil growled, and I swallowed hard. "Mary, Beth, and Ryan," Jackson added, and I shook my head, knowing he saved the last to get to Phil. They were not used to him being around me so much, and while they were mostly happy, they were still a bit protective. I remembered the whole protector thing then, and wondered about that. Did they feel more compelled to protect me? If so, why? If the Aote bonded them to us, wouldn't it be equal between me and Phil? I tilted my head a little, and then Phil moved, and I turned. "It's okay," I smiled, reaching up and touching the side of his face. "We better go back so they can fix this." I raised up my other arm, the end of the splint showing through the cuff of my coat. He finally nodded, and Jackson clapped his hands and moved towards the opening. "This is cool, though. I think I'm going to build one like it when we get back home." Just then, there was a howl that froze us all. Another one quickly followed, and Jackson slammed the cover over the hole and sat up. That howl said, "Stay where you are," and was filled with anger. "What the?" Track whispered, and Phil shook his head, holding up a hand to silence him. Another howl, and then another. Someone was heading towards the Owlsaw camp, and everyone was on alert. I swallowed hard as my heart pounded in my chest. This pack had lookouts. I had remembered hearing about that. But those howls were on edge, and my skin prickled. Suddenly, we heard something running through the brush, and we all held our breath. It stopped directly under us, and the three guys hopped into squats and circled the opening. Phil put his hand on my chest, and I moved back into one corner. "It's us," came Rock's hard whisper, and Phil yanked the cover back and pulled him up. Marcus climbed in after him, and Phil shoved the cover back in place when no one else followed. Another howl, and I looked up. This one made my whole body shake as images of rage and panic ran through me. "What's going on out there?" Track hissed. Marcus shook his head. "Company," he stated. "Uninvited company." "Bats?" Phil hissed, and I turned and looked at him. He reached out and took my hand. I yelped from the pain, and he let go, realizing he had grabbed the wrong one. "No, wolves," Rock explained, keeping his voice low. "But they aren't Poulsen or Owlsaw, and they caught him trying to sneak up." Track cursed under his breath, and I blinked, still trying to process what was happening. Why in the world would other wolves try to sneak up on this pack? "I thought no one knew where this place was," Marcus snapped, and I looked at him. He was right. This pack was a legend. Another howl, and then another. These ones were warnings to the unwanted guests. I shivered and shrank back against the wall. We were packed in here pretty tight, but I glanced down at the cover. Is this because of me? Track turned and looked at me. How could it be? He was mad, but not at me. "They're wolves." Rock shrugged. "We didn't stay to find out. As soon as we heard the warning, we came to find you." He looked at me and then at Phil. "Our protectors," I thought, then gasped, "Ryan!" We all stiffened and Rock moved towards the cover, but it moved on its own. Rock's fist came up, but stopped when we heard Cal on the other side. He poked his head through the hole, but didn't climb all the way in. His eyes looked around and then settled on Phil. "We have to get you out of here," he stated, letting his eyes dart to me and then back to Phil. "What about Ryan?" Jackson snapped. Cal held out his hand to Phil, who reached down and took something out of it. I leaned over and saw a man's wallet. What did that mean? But Phil jumped up, and so did the other guys. Track grabbed my arm. "Let's go," he said, his voice suddenly edgy. "But what about—" I asked, and then grunted as I was pushed towards the hole. "Go!" my best friend snapped at me, and I turned and lowered my legs out of the opening. Someone touched my calf, and I flinched. "Easy going down," Cal whispered, and I nodded, looking up at Phil. His face was tight as he shoved the dark billfold into his pocket. "Go!" Track snarled at me, and I jumped and then started to climb down. My arms screamed out in pain as I made my way down. I slipped at one point, but Cal grabbed me around the waist and lifted me to the ground. He pulled me out of the way as the others jumped from halfway, landing almost silently in the dirt. "This way," Cal whispered and turned, keeping my good hand in his. We turned and started to run, away from the camp. My heart was pounding, but not from the speed. It was fear and panic that thumped in my ears. Phil had taken over my hand now, and the others surrounded us, and as we rushed through the thick brush. Cal knew the woods well and maneuvered us through the terrain. Finally, when we stopped, he walked over and yanked some branches out of the way. "Take these," he huffed, and Marcus and Rock stepped over and helped him move the tree branches. "Motorcycles?" I gasped, "but I don't understand." Cal reached behind him and blinked hard as he held out my backpack to Phil. "There are phones and some other stuff in there," he stated as Phil nodded and flung it over one shoulder. Why are we—" I stuttered as the others pulled the bikes out and straddled them. There were only 4. Cal and his 3 packmates' bikes. I wondered why they had them hidden, but didn't have time to wonder long. Track grabbed me by the waist and lifted me onto the back of one. I didn't remember Phil getting on one, but I quickly wrapped my arms around his waist. I twisted around to see Track climb on another one, and Marcus hop up behind him. Rock and Jackson had the other 2. Did any of them even know how to ride a motorcycle? I yelped as Phil slammed his leg down and the bike sprang to life under us. Cal was standing next to Phil. Take the main road and head towards town. Wherever you go, I can find you. He held something else out, and Phil took it, shoving it in his pocket. Another howl rang out, and I felt my body shake. That was not an Owlsaw or a Poulsen wolf howling. Come with us, I yelled over the engine, and Cal smiled. I'll be right behind you. With that, the bike lurched. I gasped and clung on to Phil as he took off. I have no idea how he knew where he was going. We picked up speed when the terrain allowed it. I had tried to see over his shoulder, but finally gave up and pressed my face to his back. The air stung at the speeds we were going, and the tears running down my face were only from the force of it. Phil took a few turns, and I had to wonder how he knew what he was doing. At one point, he reached down and rubbed my thigh, giving me a quick touch of support. My heart still pounded in my chest, and then Rock rode up next to us when the land opened wide enough. He smiled at me and wiggled his brows, making me smile back. I half expected him to pop a wheelie to show off, but he didn't. I saw the trees disappear and then heard the sounds of animals. I gasped. "The fence!" I yelled, leaning into Phil's ear. He only nodded, and I glanced over his shoulder, resting my chin on it. The pastures were to our right this time, and I looked forward, moaning as I saw that high barrier in the distance. Then I smiled, realizing where we were headed. The hole that was made when they rescued me from the highway was still untouched. It made a gap in the wooden wall, and it was plenty wide, enough for us to ride through, which is just what we did. As soon as we hit the asphalt, Phil leaned his head back. "Hold on tight," he hollered, and then the bike cried out and picked up speed. I pulled my head back, gasping as the air was crammed down my throat, and laid against his back. We picked up more speed, and I watched the Owlsaw border blur along our left side. Jackson moved up on the side I could see, and he winked at me, his hair dancing wildly around him. I smiled, and then he fell back just a bit. The air was cold, and I shivered even with Phil's body heat. My hands were ice cold, which only my broken arm appreciated. Some time later, Phil started to slow a bit, and I heard the other bikes do the same. I had closed my eyes a while back, trying to focus on just holding on. My bad arm was hot and throbbing from the effort, and my other one was frozen to the bone. The bike slowed more, and then I looked up and watched as we moved off the road and onto the grass. Then my ears rang as the bikes were turned off, and the silence seemed to make me go deaf until they adjusted. I shook my head to clear them and almost fell off the bike as Phil was climbing off. Marcus grabbed me from the back around my waist, and I lowered my shaking legs, putting them down as I still straddled the bike. Rock had the handlebars now, and Marcus helped me off. My legs felt like rubber, and I staggered a bit. "Sit down." I nodded and plopped down in the grass, quickly shoving my good hand in my pocket to try to warm it. The guys huddled in front of me, but I didn't try to listen. I was cold. Vampires weren't affected by the temperature, hot or cold, but my werewolf blood was. I tucked my chin into the front of my coat and then buried my nose behind the zipper. Finally, they all turned, and Phil and Track walked over and squatted in front of me. I didn't like the looks on either of their faces. "We have to find a place to sit and wait this out," Phil stated. I gave a shallow nod, not wanting to pull my face from the little bit of warmth inside my jacket. "There's a town not too far from here," Track stated, and then I looked at Phil. "You're freezing," I gasped, pulling my face out of my coat. He shrugged, and I frowned. "Thermal underwear," he smiled, but I leaned over and touched his face. It was ice cold. He took my hand and pushed it back towards my pockets. "Adrenaline is keeping me plenty warm," he chuckled. "Ray, the town," I looked back at Track, who sighed. It's a human town. My eyes widened, and Rock squatted next to him. Human town? I whispered, and the three heads nodded. We'll get a room somewhere and wait for Ryan, Phil stated, and I noticed his voice shake a bit. He was cold. It's night, and humans are usually settling in about now. I sat there in shock as they explained that I wouldn't come into any direct contact with humans. Little did they know, I was a bit disappointed by that. The scent of the other two humans still tickled my brain. I was curious. When they stood, Phil reached out and pulled me up with him. How's the arm? He asked. Fine, I lied, and he frowned. Yeah, I was never going to be any good at that. This time I got on the bike without any help and wrapped my arms around him. Track walked his bike over next to us. Ryan should be up to us soon, he smiled, but his eyes didn't agree. He was worried, and I nodded slowly as the bike revved into life. We didn't go as fast this time, but I pressed myself closer to Phil, trying to give him some of my warmth. He was wearing 2 long-sleeve shirts and his coat, but since I was cold, with a heavy sweater and a coat on, I knew he must be miserable in front of me. A few minutes later, the trees thinned on the sides, and I sat up looking around. We turned down another road, and I smiled, seeing lights and buildings up ahead. Humans, I thought, excitedly, wiggling in my seat. Track moved up next to us and gave me a long look. I rolled my eyes and turned back to watch. We passed a gas station that was still open. The light from the small store inside was steady, and I caught a glimpse of 2 cars pulled up alongside of it. I knew I should be worried about what was happening back in Owlsaw, but I couldn't help get antsy and smile. I had seen humans before. Well, okay, mostly on TV, but I did have a few encounters with them. I moaned, recalling those run-ins, and vowed to keep my issues in check this time. As long as they don't try to run, I thought, then pursed my lips and growled at myself. Track yelled something, and Phil turned to the right. I moved my head and saw an old sign that said Michaud Motel, with a neon sign under it that announced there were vacancies. Rock pulled up next to us as we slowed, and Phil reached into his pocket and then tossed the wallet to the other. Rock and Jackson rode on, and Track and Phil pulled off to the side and turned the bikes off. Marcus hopped off the bike first, and Track followed, shaking his head, and then pushing the kickstand down to rest the bike. I climbed off our bike, and then Phil moved the bikes next to each other. Marcus smiled at me, and I shrugged. What else was there to do? I looked at the building and saw Rock and Jackson park their bikes and walk in. My skin prickled. There were humans, right there, only yards away. I lifted my chin and inhaled deeply. I could smell them all around me. There were 4 cars in the parking lot, and they reeked of their human owners. I took a step towards one, but Phil reached out and pulled me back. Easy there, he whispered. I just wanted to... What was I going to say? I wanted to sniff their cars? Track stepped in front of me, and I sighed. Fine, I won't sniff their cars, I thought, glancing around him at a white sedan several yards away. A human drove that car. They owned it. Probably drove it back and forth to work. I was suddenly excited and smiled like a kid that was seeing a museum come to life. A whole world that went about their lives without any idea races like ours existed. I wondered what they would do if they knew a clique of werewolves was standing out in the parking lot, right outside where they were sleeping. Probably scream and run for the hills, Track chuckled, and I bit my lip, not realizing I had thought that so he could hear. Phil stepped up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. I leaned back against him, putting my cheek against his. You are so cold, I whispered. He nodded. But you're warming me up. I smiled and turned, keeping his arms around me and snuggling up against his chest. When I heard footsteps running up to us, I only turned my head. Rock wiggled the key in the air, and then I leaned forward and drew in a long breath. "She smells them on you," Track chuckled, and Rock shook his head at me. "They're not that exciting," he winked. "Well, not the males, at least." I giggled, and then Marcus and Jackson moved our bikes further out of sight. We walked towards the hotel, and Rock pointed. "Second floor, end room." Thought it was a good strategy. Halfway up the stairs, a door opened below, and I gasped as the scent hit me. Phil pulled me up behind him, and Track pushed, but I turned to see a man walk towards a car. He wore jeans and a coat, and didn't even look up at us, but he reeked of his race, and I froze in mid-stride. "Let's go, pup," Track whispered into my ear. I nodded, but didn't move. Then the same door opened below. "Don't forget this," a female called out, and she ran towards the man with the piece of paper waving in her hand. All of my instincts fired at the same time. I grabbed the railing, ready to jump over it and give chase. My eyes locked onto my target, and a strange sound gurgled in my throat. Then I gasped as I was lifted off my feet and flung over Track's shoulder. I saw the woman look up just as we got to the top. She frowned at me, but quickly turned and started to talk to the man. My heart was pounding madly, and I scrambled to break free. I couldn't take my eyes off of her. "Hurry up with the door," Track hissed, and he turned so I was facing the brick wall of the building. I tried to twist, but he held me tight. "There," Rock huffed, and then I was inside, and the door between me and my prey shut. I cursed loudly, and then my mind seemed to clear, and I sighed. Track put me down and grabbed my shoulders, looking at me hard. I shook myself to get control. When I nodded, he did as well, and then the room was filled with light. I winced and turned, my body calming, and the sensations turning into memories. Rock was standing next to the door, and I noticed it was bolted and had a chain lock in place. "Like that would stop me," I chuckled, and then flinched when everyone stared. "I was just kidding. Sheesh." A motor roared as Marcus turned on the heat, and I looked back at Phil. He was watching me carefully, and I sighed, moving to the bed. I yanked the thin, scratchy comforter off of it and walked over, wrapping it around his shoulders. "I'm fine," I smiled, but he only gave a small nod. "We can always push that dresser in front of the door," Jackson stated, and then smiled at me. "It might at least slow her down." I huffed and then froze, inhaling slowly again. My senses were filled with the intoxicating scent, and I walked in a slow circle. Humans came here. A lot. I winced as some of the smells hit me. Seems some were not all that big on hygiene. The smells tickled my nose, and then something happened. It felt like something exploded in my nose, and my head lurched forward. I frowned, and the same thing happened again. "Crap, I think she's allergic to humans," Rock hissed, and I looked up at Phil. "You sneezed," he smiled, and I tilted my head. "Really?" He nodded again, and then it happened again. "What the heck are we going to do now?" Jackson snapped, and I looked at him. He shook his head. "Who's ever heard of a wolf being allergic to humans?" I sneezed again, and this time realized there was a tingle in my nose when it happened. It actually felt kind of good. I smiled and reached up, running a hand over the tip of my nose. "How bizarre," I giggled, and then sneezed again. "It's probably just the dust in this place," Track huffed, looking around. "This place is nasty." I wiggled my nose, going a bit cross-eyed as I tried to look at it. Phil moved closer to the large white box that was kicking out the heat. He held his hands in front of it, and I frowned, walking over to him. He smiled at me, and then I sneezed again. Track moaned behind me, and Phil chuckled. "Leave it to you to be allergic to humans." "I am?" I gasped. He shrugged. Or maybe Track is right. This place is pretty nasty. I looked around and cringed. He was right. On the surface it was tidy and appeared clean, but our wolf noses picked up the dust, mold, and rot that hid behind the walls. This place was old and wasn't very well kept. The warm air from the heater blew my hair, and I put my own hands out over it. "Kinda like a fire pit," Phil chuckled. "Or not," Rock smiled, moving next to me and putting his own hands out. He had his jacket on, but his hands were red from the cold ride. "Thanks. Now I'm hungry," Jackson snapped, and we all turned. "What?" he shrugged. "Fire pit? Food?" He waved his hands like the connection was obvious, and I smiled. I didn't have to eat in this form, but werewolves needed food, and often. Phil shook his head. "We'll wait for Ryan." "I've got to start writing more," Marcus put in, and I giggled. He smiled at me, and Rock nodded. "I haven't written in forever." I turned and walked over to one of the beds, but when I went to sit on it, Phil reached out and pulled me back. No," he stated, and I frowned. Track nodded, and he and Marcus yanked all the bedding off and then flipped the mattress. I shivered, and didn't need to ask why. Finally, I was able to sit down, and even then I was a bit stiff. Then I sneezed again, and for some reason Jackson found that hilarious. He threw back his head and roared with laughter. When the room warmed up, I unzipped my jacket and pulled it off. "Holy crap," Jackson hissed and plopped down in front of me. I looked down and moaned. The back of my hand was swollen and red now. Not a good sign. When I sneezed again, Phil sat down next to me and put the back of my hand on his forehead. He paused with it there and then sighed in relief. "No fever." "Fever?" I asked, and he nodded. "Vampires don't get sick," I smiled, and he gave me a look that said I didn't seem to go by any set of rules anymore. I shrugged and then sneezed again. "I've never heard of anyone being allergic to humans either," Jackson chuckled, and I shot him a hard look. Phil took my hand and felt it carefully. Then he started to undo the bandages that held the splint in place. I winced and saw the marks the wrapping left. He sighed again and then carefully felt up my arm. "She rebroke it," he whispered, and I bit my lip. "I'm sorry," I whimpered, and he looked up at me and shook his head. "No, Tay, I'm sorry." Then he yanked hard and fast. Track leapt forward and slapped his hand over my mouth to cover my scream as Phil set the brake. I gasped and panted, trying to catch my breath. The pain shot through every part of me. Track leaned forward, and I dropped my head onto his shoulder as Phil quickly rewrapped my arm. When he was done, I stayed against Track until I caught my breath. Phil rubbed my back. "I had to set it before it tried to heal wrong," he explained, leaning forward and resting his forehead against my cheek. I nodded, but stayed still a few minutes more until the pain eased. The room went completely quiet, and finally I sat up and nodded. Phil leaned over and kissed my lips softly. "I am sorry." I nuzzled against him and let him know I wasn't mad. "Thank you," I whispered, and Track turned and stood up. He moved to the window, and I watched him pull back the curtain. "It's Cal," he stated, and we all jumped up. Phil was at the window, and the other three moved in front of me. "Aaron's with him," Phil explained, and Track opened the door and waved out it. I heard feet running up the stairs and watched as Track stepped back and the other two hurried in. They were both flushed, and Cal instantly looked at Phil. "Well?" I shouted when no one said anything. Marcus leaned over to me, and then Phil turned. "Stay here." "What?" I snapped when Track opened the door. Phil looked at me. "We're just going outside to talk." That ticked me off. Why? Why can't they just tell us what's going on? Jackson stepped into my line of view, and I glared at him. "Move, Jay," I hissed, but it was too late. I heard the door shut. I growled and then brought up my foot and slammed it down hard. Jackson yelped and hopped, looking at me with wide eyes. I lifted my chin and headed towards the door. Rock stepped in front of it and held out his hands. "Come on now, Ray," he pleaded. When I moved closer, he shook his head. "I can't let you out there." My head turned and I eyed the window. That made him chuckle. "Not so easy to do on two legs, and you'll draw all the attention we're trying to avoid." Huffing, I turned and plopped back down on the mattress. He had me there. Chapter 14. My arm started to throb, and Marcus sat next to me. He took my coat and bunched it up, then lifted my arm and slid it under. I gave him a small thank you, and he smiled down at me. They weren't really gone that long, but I was ticked and only turned my head when they walked back in. "Pack it up. We're headed out," Track stated hard. I sat up slowly and looked around. He gave a low growl, and I shrugged. Hey, I was sick and tired of being left out all the time. When I took too long to stand up, he reached down and yanked me up by the waist. I grunted and shoved him when I was on my feet, but he ignored it. My anger faded and worry seeped in. Phil looked just as serious when he reached out and took my good hand. He grabbed my backpack off the dresser and we rushed out the door, nearly running down the stairs. I headed towards the bike, but Phil pulled me towards the SUV. It was one of ours. Jackson jumped up in front and Cal climbed in next to him. I was nearly pushed in the back and grunted when I landed sideways on the seat. Track mumbled an apology when he jumped in behind me, and Phil growled at him as he helped me up and sat next to me. When the door closed, I turned and saw Marcus, Rock, and Aaron running towards the bikes. They jumped on 3 of them, and then our car started and Jackson backed it up and then turned, heading towards the road. "So, is anyone going to tell me what's going on?" Track said no at the same time Phil said yes. Phil sighed. "Everyone's fine, but we need to get you further away," he stated, as if that cleared up everything. I frowned, and he shrugged without saying more. Then he moved over to the other seat and leaned over, talking quietly to Cal in the front. When I looked at Track, he shook his head, and I glared at him. This was ridiculous. Phil finally moved back next to me and turned. "The wolves that invaded the Owlsaw territory are not friends," he stated. I bit my tongue to keep the duh from jumping out. "They were after you," he stated, and my eyes widened. "After me?" He nodded hard, looking up front and then turning back to me. "We don't know exactly why yet," he sighed when I glared at him. "Cal and Aaron were told to throw some stuff in the rig and come find us." Cal turned, leaning his arm over the seat and nodding. "Will and Ryan told us to get you as far away as possible and then to bed down and wait." My eyes watered and he shook his head. "Just until they can figure out what's going on," he stated, trying to ease the last statement. I heard the motorcycle engines and saw them pass us and get in the lead. "Just follow Aaron," Cal stated, and then turned back. "There were about 20 of them," he explained, then looked at Phil. My wolf turned to me. "Half of them rode up the main road while the others snuck around," he stated. "They were trying to claim that they came to help." "But they aren't?" I asked. Phil shook his head, doubtful, or they wouldn't have been trying to sneak up on the camp. I looked down at the seat and Phil leaned over. "Ryan also said 2 very specific orders for you." "For me?" I gasped. He nodded. "You are not to run off under any circumstances," he smiled when I balked. "And you are not to try to act like this could somehow be your fault." Phil kissed my cheek then, and I huffed. How could it not be my fault? "Owlsaw has been hidden all these years," I whined. "No one knew where they were. Until now. Phil chuckled and Track leaned forward. Do you know what happens to a pup that disobeys an alpha's direct order? I rolled my eyes and sat back against the seat. We all knew that the order had to come directly from the alpha for that to work, and although it forced us to do a lot of things, it really didn't have the power to force us not to feel guilt. Track shrugged. Phil's an alpha too, remember that. My eyes went wide and I turned. I mean, yeah, I knew that. But hearing Track say it in this context... Phil smiled and reached over, pulling me to him. I would order you not to feel guilty if I could, he chuckled. Unfortunately, that's something that's beyond an alpha's control. I huffed and then Track shrugged. But he can order you not to run off. Shut up, Track, I snapped, but my best friend just laughed, and so did the two up front. I growled, and Phil hugged me to him. That I will do. When I looked up at him, he nodded. In a heartbeat. Wow, that was crap. I folded my arms across my chest and ignored the smile on the four faces around me. I sat up as we merged onto a busier highway and watched as the three motorcycles fought to keep in front of us. I gasped as one car moved into our lane and one of the bikes had to swerve hard to avoid being hit. Jackson cussed and laid on his horn. I moved to the other seat and leaned over the front. I saw an arm come out of the passenger side and someone flipped us off. I huffed and Jackson sat forward and growled. I nodded my agreement and he sped up, coming within inches of their bumper. Back it off now, came a hard voice behind us, and we shivered from the low rumble that came at the end. I turned my head and looked at Phil, a mix of awe and irritation in my head. Track chuckled next to me and I looked at my best friend, then back at Phil, trying to remember if I had ever seen him go truly alpha on us before. Then I remembered the fair and quickly turned back around. That wasn't something I wanted to think about ever again. I shivered and Track laughed. Somehow my good arm just happened to slip and land against the back of his head. Hey, he shouted, and I shrugged. Oops, sorry. Then turned back around, looking out the front window between Jackson and Cal. So, am I allowed to know where we're going? I asked, looking at Cal. He shrugged. Not really sure myself. When I balked, he shrugged. We were told to get far enough away without being too far. Aaron will find a good spot. Cal wasn't lying, but what an odd plan. I turned back around. How will Ryan find us? I asked, looking at Phil. He's our alpha. He'll find us, he said with a smile. I had to smile back, that pack pride seeping in. I turned back around, rested my good arm on the back of the seat, my chin on my arm, and watched the cars as we drove. I kept my eye on the three motorcycles and finally thought I had figured out who was who. It was kind of hard to tell in the dark, with them weaving in and out of the cars. We didn't have any more near accidents, though, and I was glad for that. Finally, we got off the main freeway and headed down a smaller, more crowded one. I stiffened when I saw all the bright lights ahead, and Jackson moaned, Great construction. Phil knelt next to me as we inched up alongside one of the motorcycles. It was Aaron. Jackson rolled down the window, and Aaron shrugged. We need to turn around. Jackson leaned forward and looked into the side mirror, then looked out and around. Let's flip it right here, he stated. Aaron nodded and rode up to the other two bikes. Flip it? I asked, not liking the sound of that. Phil smiled. Turn around, he explained. Oh, I smiled, relieved. Jackson turned and looked behind us. I leaned to the side to let him see. Then he cranked the wheel and inched forward slowly. When he couldn't move any more, due to some large cement blocks, He shifted into reverse and backed up. Someone honked, but he ignored it and kept moving back. He shifted again and cranked the wheel. We were on the side of the road now, facing the wrong way. The lights from cars lined up was nearly blinding, but Jackson continued forward, slowly driving up the dirt side of the road. It was a tight squeeze, and we heard some people shouting out their windows at us. But when I looked out the back window, I saw other cars starting to follow our lead. The rest of them are going to be sitting there for a long time, Jackson chuckled, as he sat forward and watched over the hood to make sure he didn't rub against the large barriers on our right. Someone rolled down their window as we passed, flipped us off, and left a string of cussing as we inched by. Jackson ignored them, as did I. Alpha orders have a way of sticking, even when you don't realize it. The motorcycles had to move slowly too. The road was full of holes and uneven from the work being done. I looked back again and chuckled to see a stream of white lights as a lot more cars decided we were the smarter way. Finally, we pulled up onto pavement and turned down a fully constructed road. "Where are we?" I asked, leaning over and looking around. There were street lights and buildings on either side, but I didn't recognize the names of any of the streets. Then I shrugged, since I had no idea why I thought I would. One of the motorcycles turned off and the others followed. So did we. I smiled when I saw the motel sign and was happy to see it looked much nicer than the last one. And I'm gonna stop there.